happening, folks? And welcome to the channel. Shh, I'm hunting wascally wabbits. Today we're diving into one of the most brutally effective British horror films of the early 2000s. If you've seen the film already, you'll know on its surface it is a savage hoodie horror featuring a lovely young couple who ends up in the wrong place at the worst imaginable time. But beneath all that surface level violence, writer-director James Watkins was having a proper stab at some bigger societal fears. Because at the time he was making this movie, Britain itself was threatening to fall apart. Aren't my movie reviews fun? Now obviously these descriptions of the movie are accurate, but what if I told you the real horror in this movie actually lies somewhere within your own assumptions? My friend Leo from Geek Legion of Doom put it as eloquently as he always puts everything when he said, "This movie is terrifying because of its plausibility. This movie is terrifying because it feels like something that could happen to you. Like this Friday night. Right next to that tree." I have no idea how I didn't catch that on the way in. But by the end of this video, I am going to try and demonstrate something else. After I show you the main events of this story from two slightly different perspectives, you might realize you haven't just been watching the horrors of Eden Lake, you might have been taking part in them. When the movie starts, Jenny, the primary school teacher, and her boyfriend Steve are en route to an idyllic weekend away. Jenny's looking forward to some well-earned downtime, and Steve is planning on popping the big question. Steve's first interaction with the locals is at a stoplight. The instant their bikes cross his path when he has the right of way, his face tells us he's not very happy. Inside the pub, the bartender skips right past Steve and asks Jenny what she wants, as if she can sense Steve's annoyance. Back at their bed and breakfast, Steve's annoyed again by locals arguing outside their room, and it kind of makes you wonder why he bothered choosing the location in the first place. The following morning, as they're pulling into the quarry Steve's been going on about, they find out it's been cordoned off as a future gated community named Eden Lake. Taken in the biblical sense, Eden represents a place of utopia or paradise that ultimately and inevitably becomes corrupted by virtue of our wonderful natures as human beings. And after they've secured their idyllic spot next to the water, the local young'uns arrive, and Steve isn't happy about their music or their presence in general. So, he tells them to turn their music down. And not surprisingly, they have no interest in turning their music down. And when Jenny suggests they just go find somewhere else, Steve brings the first act to a close and locks both of them into their ultimate fates by reminding her they were there first. The next morning, they find their food infested with insects, and as they head off into town for something to eat, they back over a bottle that flattens their tire. This infuriates Steve, who is already on edge having to tolerate the behavior of half the town, and he calls the kids little fuckers through clenched teeth. We witness the inciting incident to kick everything else off, and we settle into our comfy chairs to watch the inevitable escalation of events. They cross paths with a bunch of kids later on, and they ask him how his tire's doing. An hour later, at the local diner, Steve asks the waitress if she's seen a group of kids on bikes, which, in a tiny town like this one, of course she has. And the exchange turns sour quickly when the waitress becomes defensive. And after they leave the restaurant, they pass a house with lots of bikes outside, and unable to let things go, Steve sticks his head inside to take a look around. When the homeowner returns, Steve sneaks out the back window, and after the narrow escape, they head back to their tent at the beach, and right as Steve is about to pop the big question, they realize their bag and the car has been stolen. On the walk back into town, Brett, the gang leader, makes it sparkling clear who stole the Jeep. And he playfully declares victory and a bit of dominance over Steve from behind both his steering wheel and his sunglasses. Later that night in the forest, Steve insists on getting his car and his phone and his sunglasses back, but Brett stonewalls him. He says the glasses are his own, and he denies knowledge of the car's whereabouts. Drawing the line in the sand between the two groups turns things physical, and Brett's dog gets stabbed to death in the ensuing scuffle by Steve. But after scooping the car keys up from the ground and running off into the night, they find the Jeep as the kids chase after them with murderous intent. And when Steve crashes the Jeep trying to escape, Jenny's got no choice but to flee for help as Steve's injuries have him pinned into the car. But she ends up circling back to where the kids are taking turns slashing at Steve. Jenny manages to draw them off for just long enough to allow Steve to break free from the barbed wire, but his newfound freedom is short-lived, as is Steve. And with that, Jenny slips into the final girl role, which actually suits her. Jenny gets him into the temporary cover of a shed, where she cleans him up as best she can, but they discover the depth of his stab wounds, and that darkens the tone and his outlook. They duck into the water for cover, and she puts his ring on for encouragement before she heads off to the hills to find help. But she ends up taking a railway spike between the old metatarsals, and that's when she bumps into the biggest dick in movie history. The kid the other kids were bullying earlier leads her towards town, except he's actually leading her right into their hands. And the gang knocks her out. When she wakes up, she's next to Steve, who will never wake up again. The young boy is forced to set Steve on fire, so our final girl keeps her head and uses the opportunity to break free. She escapes to more temporary safety under the cover of human waste. And once she's seen what's become of herself, she leaves her school teacher persona behind, Apocalypse Now style, and drives a shard of broken glass into the throat of Cooper, played by Thomas Turgoose, who on a side note made a name for himself 2 years earlier playing Sean Fields in another powerhouse British drama. And if you'd like to see what real non-Hollywood child acting looks like when the director is obsessed with story and not glamour, check out This Is England. But as Cooper is expiring, Jenny realizes what she's done, and the teacher in her, the true her, returns to break her down. When Brett finds Cooper's body, anything left of his composure disintegrates into the old ultraviolence. Meanwhile, Jenny finally finds a spot in the fence to poke through, and she makes it out to the next passerby, who happens to be the brother of one of the gang. So Jenny ends up back on the run again. This time it's just in time to drive right through Paige the Unpleasant. And after eventually crashing the stolen car, Jenny brings the second act to a close when she finds herself in the safety of a backyard full of partying locals who are all strangely familiar. When she regains consciousness on the couch, she immediately recognizes the dog situation, in that Clyde is missing his Bonnie, and it only takes a moment for the remainder of the two worlds to reconnect with devastating consequences. The scenario she finds herself back in is also too familiar. This is where I need to take a pause. If you weren't fully engaged with this story from the start, it's very easy to write it off as a lovely young couple gets set upon by a group of unruly kids in the countryside. I would bet most people see it that way, and there's nothing wrong with that. But remember, James Watkins is exploring the cultural conflicts of 2008. Unfortunately, that same conflict applies to almost every one of us now in 2025. And now, as I show you a few things I've already showed you, but from a slightly different angle, you might realize how complex and surprisingly tricky these things actually are. Some of the people who don't like this movie suggest it's too close to torture porn to offer any real depth or subtext. While I understand how somebody might get that impression, if you pay close attention to this movie, James Watkins tells you exactly what he plans on examining before the story's even started. While Jenny's napping, there's a talk radio program discussing something called the Respect Agenda. Now, I have no intention of bogging you down with politics, but a quick Google search will tell you the 2005 Tony Blair government introduced legislation to tackle unacceptable behavior among youth at the time, which fell under their political slogan, Broken Britain, which is exactly what this movie is examining. The radio discussion continues throughout the entire opening credit sequence. For over 60 seconds, people calling into the radio station discuss the subjects this movie is about to examine. When Steve comes to the first stoplight in town and they rush the light, they have halted his progress, and his face tells us this is unacceptable to him. In this little scene, we're witnessing the philosophies that'll drive the physical violence forward in this story. From this moment on, with Broken Britain in mind, Steve ceases to be Steve, and he becomes the face of the affluent and aspirational British middle class. By default, that makes the teenagers and the rest of this town the disenfranchised working class. Both sides are now lined up and locked in for the battle, and now that you know that, you will see that opposition motivating every interaction going forward. Interestingly, as a school teacher, Jenny isn't in full alignment with Steve philosophically, and that starts to show right away. When the bartender skips Steve, the men sense the mutual disdain. The tension in this room existed long before Steve and Jenny arrived, and there's nothing secret about it. To further illustrate the fundamental differences between the couple, Steve says it's a bit past their bedtime, isn't it? Suggesting he doesn't want the nuisance of the misbehaving local kids around during his adult holiday. But Jenny replies with concern. Yeah, the poor things must be exhausted, she says. Once again, Steve's face paints the picture while it illustrates the different places the couple are coming from, and why Steve will never be able to back down. As they're pulling into the picturesque Eden Lake, the graffiti makes it pretty clear how the locals feel about the impending property development. We talked about the corruptive elements of human nature, but what's interesting in this film is examining which side is doing the corrupting. Superficially, it seems obvious the wayward youth represent the corrupting forces in this situation, but if you offer both sides the benefit of the doubt so they're starting out on equal footing, you might find things shift a bit. When the cooler is infested and the tire pops, we support Steve in calling the kids little fuckers. We probably did it ourselves under our breath. But why? There's no evidence suggesting either was anything more than an accident, but we just went along with it anyways. When the kids on the bikes asked him how his tire was, Steve was already positive they were the culprits. But throughout this movie, James Watkins places these handheld shots strategically to mimic somebody watching them from the bushes. They might have been watching him change the tire and giggling the whole time. They're local kids off school, and Steve's already drawn enough attention to himself to encourage them to watch him. At the restaurant, the waitress began the interaction with the pleasant, helpful tone of a seasoned waitress. Steve shifted that tone by asking her about the kids. And when he did, she still remained pleasant by asking Steve playfully if the kids were terrorizing them. And when Steve suggested the children are actually harassing them, the waitress giggled and reminded him he's a full-grown man. And given what's actually transpired between them up until this point, she was absolutely correct. The kids have mouthed off and played their music too loud, but that's what kids do at beaches. Even Jenny's looking at him disapprovingly. Things only turn sour when Steve pushes the point, and that brings out the protective mother who suddenly feels this entitled tourist might be calling her parenting into question, the way you probably would. After the restaurant, when they pass the house, our bias favoring this couple masks the fact Steve is breaking the law and violating the privacy of an entire family who've potentially done literally nothing to him at this stage. While he's invading the home, he sees a photo confirming he is in the teenager's house, and then he sees evidence of domestic turmoil. As an intelligent, perceptive adult who should be capable of understanding what this all adds up to, Steve instead adds 1 and 1 together and comes up with 5. But prior to escaping out the back, I should point out the homeowner does see Jenny and the Jeep. Back at the beach, while Steve was swimming and Jenny was napping, we see another voyeuristic handheld shot supporting the idea the kids are watching them, as curious kids would. But this time, Brett shows Steve he's taken his car. Depending on the social circles you travel in, you might consider a Jeep Cherokee or a pair of Ray-Ban aviators to be proof you've done well for yourself in life. We assume this is a straightforward display of inexcusable antisocial violent criminality, which of course it is. But how would you react if you found out some entitled stuck-up tourist who tried bossing you around at your own beach just broke into your family home too? And before you answer that, it's not how would you react, it's how do you imagine this troubled teen raised in a home surrounded by violence might react? When the groups cross paths again in the forest that night, understandably, Steve's patience has evaporated. Jenny just wants to leave, but Steve's incapable of turning the other cheek. When Brett playfully denies knowledge of Steve's property, Steve's true feelings bubble to the surface when he suggests Brett could never afford a pair of aviators. And when that scuffle turns vigorous, Brett's dog gets killed. If you're a dog person, whether you've owned one yourself or not, it goes without saying, for many people, a dog is a member of the family. Seeing the knives out during this exchange and bearing in mind Brett had openly stole their property, we find ourselves supporting the couple once again. But after the scuffle, they do find the Jeep tucked away safely in the forest about 30 feet away. It's not burnt out, the windows aren't smashed, the tires aren't even flat. It's just sitting there, possibly suggesting Brett had no intention of keeping the vehicle beyond getting Steve back for breaking into his home. Otherwise, why not torch it? After Jenny circled back to find Steve worse for wear, initially this scene seems horrific, and many people cite it as the worst in the film in terms of its realism and brutality. As a hardened, seasoned, jaded old horror fan, even I wouldn't suggest this scene's anything other than brutal. However, what I will point out is the motivation behind it. While I'm not excusing Brett's actions as the Drugan leader of this young gang of chavs, forcing each member of the gang to inflict an injury on Steve robs each of them of their ability to report him to the police should things go sideways. I doubt most people listening to this would ever think in these terms, but somebody raised in a home like Brett probably would. Likely because his father would kill him if he didn't. Things have absolutely escalated, and as far as Steve and most of the audience is probably concerned, it's entirely Brett's fault. But again, on equal footing, what does Brett see? Steve arrived in his hometown and ordered him to turn down his music on a beach he'd grown up on, a beach about to become off limits to them when people like Steve and Jenny claim it for their own. He told him how to treat his dog on that same beach, and he broke into his home, and he insulted him and his family's social status before killing his dog. To Steve, Brett is the devil, and looking at this scene, it is easy to see why he feels that way. But to Brett, Steve is also the devil. And if you truly accept both parties entered into this on equal footing, you don't have to squint that hard to see the mirroring effect of these two forces coming together. When Jenny ends up on the couch, everything comes full circle. Throughout this story, we've watched Brett, the gang leader, dominate and abuse anybody who disagreed with him or tried opposing him. And now, back in Brett's house, we see exactly where Brett gets it from. His father behaves the exact same. He even uses the same language and logic to bend everybody to his will. This final scene reminds us, at the end of this story, after this series of back and forth exchanges between two opposing classes of people, no progress has been made on either side. Jenny's dragged unceremoniously into the bathtub to meet her end, caught up in this conflict as a total innocent bystander. And Brett's sent to his room, where he deletes all the video evidence from his phone. And the film closes with Brett slipping on Steve's glasses, and they serve as a neat, literal symbol of class and success and a life he will never have. But then he takes them off and stares right down the lens. And that is the real message of this movie. That look isn't for Steve, it's for us. Watkins is pointing straight at the lazy political fantasy that problems like this can be solved by a slogan or a policy tweak or by blaming whichever class is easiest to demonize. Eden Lake refuses that simplicity. Brett isn't a stand-in for feral youth, and Steve isn't the flawless middle-class hero. They're just humans trapped inside economic and social and generational systems neither of them chose. And that is the uncomfortable part. If fixing the world was as simple as swapping identities or wearing somebody else's sunglasses, we'd only create a new argument about whose sunglasses were the right ones to wear in the first place. So, the movie turns the question back on me and on you. How often did you and Steve make the same snap judgment? Did you find yourself automatically supporting Steve or blindly judging Brett? How often do any of us assume we know who somebody is just from looking at them? This movie suggests the rot at the heart of these big problems doesn't start with kids like Brett. It starts with the assumptions and the judgments we all pack away into our little picnic baskets before we've even had a chance to step into the forest to contaminate our own little versions of Eden Lake. As always, thank you very much for watching my little video. If you've enjoyed yourself, hit the like button, consider subscribing, and until next time, folks.